welcome to the MessianTics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Welcome back to the podcast. We're going to discuss some things this week that is, I think, important. I think it's something we need to come to terms with. And I'm going to begin by sharing just a little bit of my story as an entry into this. I was raised in a Jewish home, very practicing. My family was very involved in our synagogue. I then came to faith in Yeshua in a Pentecostal church. And when that happened, I was told my identity as a Jew changed. Now I was no longer a Jew. I was now a Christian. And then time went on. I became a pastor within a Pentecostal denomination. And while pastoring a church, I felt the Lord speak to my heart. And just as clearly as I'm talking to you, I heard the words, "You're a Jew, live like one." Those words fundamentally shifted my world. I didn't exactly understand what it meant and what it would bring about, but it shifted everything about my wife and our ministry together, what we were doing. We ended up finding Messianic Judaism as an offshoot of that statement from the Lord, and things went on. But during this time, I went through another identity crisis. And, Ron Cantor wrote a book called Identity Crisis. Paul Lieberman wrote a book that's entitled Don't Call Me a Christian. There's lots within the Messianic movement, especially among Messianic Jewish people in my generation and the previous generation. We experienced a real crisis of where our feet stood, who we were. Not in believing in Yeshua, because I had no question once I became a believer in Yeshua that was my root, that was what I was connected to. But how that looked as an identity, how that looked as somebody who was raised in a Jewish home, then transitioned to a Christian environment, and then transitioned to a Messianic Jewish environment. And in the process of trying to work that out for myself, and at the same time other people in my generation, the previous generation, during the Jesus movement, during the early renewed Messianic Jewish movement in the United States, where many Jewish people like myself came to faith because of a Christian church or a Christian outreach, and then transitioned to a Messianic Jewish expression. There wasn't a guideline. There wasn't a program. There wasn't okay, step one is this, step two is this, step three is this. This is what Jewish believers do. This is what Jewish believers believe. This is how they live and act, which is why even today, if you go from one Messianic Jewish congregation to another, you'll see significant differences in how much liturgy they do, whether they have a Torah scroll or not, whether they wear kippot, whether the women wear head coverings or no head coverings, whether they eat kosher or not, or don't eat kosher. All of these things are a result of this identity crisis that each of us experienced all in the same time, or in the same time period, without having someone that we could point to and say, there's someone who walked it. Now I want to walk in their steps. When the early believers accepted Yeshua as the Messiah, they had walked with him. They understood. And then they had Paul, who had a supernatural experience and then led and was this is what Messianic Judaism or the whatever you want to call what the early believers were at that time, and this is how we do that. Then there's 2,000 years almost that go by before this renewed expression comes. So I want to talk about that from my perspective as the 61-year-old in the group, and then each of you who are one generation at least behind me that have had a whole generation of experience and changes that came to be before that point. In other words, when the MJAA, which was the Hebrew Christian Alliance of America, first started forming, they were debating about whether to wear kippot, whether to have Torahs, whether to do liturgy, all of those things. To a great extent, those decisions have been made within our movement. But there's still this lingering identity. Where do I stand? Am I part of the church? Am I part of Judaism? And the wrestling match to encourage it. In one way, we just, 3 of the 4 of us went to hear Amy Jill Levine speak in Mobile. Now, one of the things that made her very palatable and exciting and interesting to the Messianic Jewish movement was her acceptance of Messianic Judaism as a branch of Judaism, as a type of Judaism. It fed our desire to have an identity within the Jewish community, which is something that we've fought for dramatically. We wanted to prove we were a branch of that tree. And so there's that. But then there's also the fact that we're tied into the church. In some way, we're connected with the greater body of Messiah. And that tension between those two things causes a continuing identity crisis among people, especially my age. How do I relate? When somebody says, "Oh, you're a Christian," it's my internal reaction to say, "Well, no, I'm not a Christian. I'm a Messianic Jew. I'm this." Right. There's a response, a repellence that naturally grows within me when that's said. "Oh, you're a pastor." "No, I'm a rabbi." Those kind of things. And it's an innate thing within me to self-identify, to argue back against an identity that's not necessarily accurate, but also isn't necessarily inaccurate at the same time.
Right.
So you guys grew up, my son grew up under this curtain, this umbrella. He was always raised in Messianic Jewish from when he was young, and so he didn't experience some of those things. You two came to Messianic Judaism from the Christian world, so you have your own identity experience and transition in going through that. So all of us come from a slightly different perspective, but I think all of us and everybody in Messianic Judaism in some way has this tension of an identity crisis, even if we don't want to admit it, that we wrestle with. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about, because I think it is something that is real for almost everybody who will be listening to this, and it's something that in my opinion, have to get past.
And not to broaden the topic more than it already is, but I also want to add in that one of the unique things with the perspective of this particular podcast is that it's 2 Jews and 2 Gentiles who are all Messianic Jewish rabbis in a Messianic Jewish congregation. And so there is an innate identity crisis both for Jews in Messianic Judaism and Gentiles in Messianic Judaism. And at least on the Gentile side, a big part of that is that we've spent so much effort trying to define what a Gentile isn't within Messianic Judaism that we have yet to put much effort into trying to define what a Messianic Gentile is in Messianic Judaism. So if that makes sense, like we've gone out of our way to say, oh, you can't, you're not Jewish, you're not this, you're not that, you can't do these practices, or you can't be called a rabbi, you can't be called this, you can't do that. But we really haven't gone, okay, well, what are Gentiles supposed to do? What are Gentiles supposed to be within? And so within this particular podcast, as one of the major perks to discussing the antics of Messianic Judaism, which is where MessianTics comes from, is that we get to dive into that from a really, I think, interesting perspective, having kind of bridged that gap to some degree and are actually wrestling with that issue in a day-to-day battle, not a day-to-day battle, but a day-to-day course in our own congregations and ministries as we navigate that together without, while there are distinctions between Jew and Gentile, there's not a distinction in our role in what we're doing and what our goals and visions are, if that makes sense. So I just want to throw that out there as we start this conversation and begin rolling. So I'll let you guys dive into with your thoughts first.
Well, for me, and this is Rabbi Toby, I think that that was when I came to a Messianic synagogue for the first time. Again, I talked about this in a previous episode. I've talked about it a few times, but there was an immediate change I felt the presence of God more powerful than any other time in my life, and I heard God tell me that my life wasn't going to be the same again. So I knew that God was welcoming me in. That God was, regardless of what anyone else may say, I knew what God was telling me. All three Messianic congregations that I've attended over the course of the past 18 years, 18 years. All of them have been predominantly non-Jewish. And I think that that's the case in a lot of Messianic synagogues. I don't have the numbers, but which makes sense just because of global demographics.
Right.
Unless there is unless a Messianic Jewish synagogue is going out of its way to exclude and make sure that non-Jews don't come.
Right.
But when I came in to Messianic Judaism, I already, again, like Rabbi Eric said, it didn't change my faith in Messiah.
Right.
Yeshua is still the Messiah. It just changed my expression of how I worshiped him, which was in a Jewish way. And as I got into Messianic Judaism more, a month, a few months, 6 months, maybe a year, that's when I started to ask the question, okay, why am I here? Why did you bring me into this, Lord?
Right.
I did go through and I've said this before, I did go through I got robbed by the church, and the church is missing so many things, and the church is wrong, and I had a very bad attitude about that, and I had to apologize to quite a few people with how I came off, and I had a lot of zeal, very little knowledge. And I wish I could go back and talk to, the 25, 26-year-old me, But yeah, I started to question why God brought me here, And the overwhelming number of Jewish voices to me over the past 18 years have been very welcoming. Mm-hmm. Listen, God needs the Jew and the Gentile. God needs us both. And the problem is that I don't know if it's just human nature, but those voices of negativity can still seep in, and I have heard a few really derogatory things said about Gentiles in the movement.
Right. Some of them are very loud.
Right. And I think it's this understanding, some of them are very loud, but I think for me it was the understanding of, and what God has taken me through my journey was getting the understanding of what it means, what it meant when God chose the Jewish people, not because he liked them more than all the other nations, and not because they were more righteous than all the other nations. In fact, God actually speaks to that pretty blatantly when he says it's not because of your righteousness that I chose you. Right. And I think that there's still this this balance that we try to attain of understanding, one, that there's no distinction. There is a distinction between the calling of the Jew and the non-Jew. But God doesn't discriminate in his spirit and in how much he loves us and in how inclusive he is. But I think that it was important for me to, that journey's not over for me. I wouldn't have never imagined when I walked into a Messianic synagogue back in 2005 that I'd be a rabbi one day.
Right.
I was happy just to be exposed to this. I was happy just to take a Siddur home and read, and learn the liturgy.
Right.
It was like that was enough for me. The fact that God has had more in store has been absolutely because of his grace. But I think it takes time, but it also takes sound teaching. Like it's hard for me when I encounter resistance from my Jewish brethren in the faith.
Right.
It's hard for me, but it was initially hard for me. Now it's almost like when it happens, I'm like, almost welcome. I don't want to say I welcome that, but I'm almost like, I've learned how to channel that negative energy into pressing into God, and it just affirms more of how I felt of my calling in the movement.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, and I kind of look at it this way, that we're striving for accuracy without arrogance.
Right.
that we want both Jewish and non-Jewish believer in Messiah Yeshua to walk biblically, to walk accurately to the Scripture, accurately to the history, accurately to their callings, accurately to the distinctions, without being arrogant and separating in the process. And that's difficult. It's funny to me, and I was having this discussion just the other day, that people will talk about appropriating culture or appropriating Jewish things or whatever. But those people that we talk to, when somebody in church says hallelujah or says amen, nobody says, oh no, they shouldn't say that because someone will think they're trying to be Jewish or they're trying to appropriate Judaism or Jewishness.
Right.
When somebody eats matzo ball soup, nobody looks at them and says, oh wait, we shouldn't serve that to them because if that Gentile eats matzo ball soup, someone might think that they're Jewish and they're not, or someone might think that they're trying to be Jewish when they're not.
Right.
And so I kind of look at our worship, like at our synagogue, at your synagogue, at Congregation Mount Chaim. They're both made up of both Jewish people and non-Jewish people. All of the Jewish people know they're Jewish. All the non-Jewish people know they're not Jewish.
Yes.
There's not an identity. There's not nobody on the Jewish side is wishing they were Gentile. Nobody on the Gentile side is desiring or wanting to be Jewish. Mm-hmm. They understand the distinction of the role, but yet they worship together when both parts of the congregation, both sides join together in the Shema, or the Vahavta, or the Amida, or any of the prayers that are prayed. No one is in the back going, oh, I can identify this, or they're misappropriating, or they're doing this or that. But that's because there's sound teaching that says that we're grafted into the same tree. I'm just as grafted into the olive tree as Jonathan is, Rabbi Jonathan. He's a non-Jewish or a wild branch that's grafted into the tree, but I'm a broken off branch. My family were not believers all the way back to the time of Messiah. We're one of the branches that was broken off, and we're regrafted into that tree, and we're feeding from the same tree. We're unique and diverse and distinct, but still part of the same tree. And that can be achieved if we don't barb at and recoil at the fear of something becoming something because somebody acted some way. In other words, if I'm not afraid that Rabbi Jonathan is going to suddenly believe he's Jewish, then I have no problem with him wearing a kippah or wearing a talit or whatever. And nobody's going to look at him because he identifies very clearly that he's not.
Right.
And so those that take, if we can remove that fear of the loss of an identity, then that changes the ball game.
Right. And the whole cultural appropriation argument to me is kind of, because like, where does it end? Where do you stop with that? Because Eastern churches, Eastern Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Coptic churches, all their designs are based on ancient synagogues. So is that cultural appropriation? A lot of the priestly vestments found within the Catholic Church, the mitre, for example, is designed after the turban that the high priest would wear. And appears in a lot of early ancient Christian art as a symbol of that same thing. So is that appropriation? So now do you just desire to have the control over Gentiles who come into your spaces and tell them, oh, you can't wear talit, you can't wear a kippah, you can't say certain prayers? Do you just desire to have that level of control over these people? Because I doubt you're going to the Eastern Orthodox meetings. I doubt you're going to the diocese meetings with the Roman Catholic Church and going like, you appropriated this from us and you need to give it back. How dare you? Don't see that happening. So to me that's why it's really just kind of like those kind of like cultural appropriation, just limiting that to things like certain prayers tallit and kippah, it's disingenuous and kind of petty. And we have a word for that in the Army that I'm not going to use on this podcast. But we,
Is it a word or an acronym?
No, it's a word. It really shows a level of, I'll call it audacity, because that seems to be on sale nowadays, that is only prevalent within people who have a severe identity crisis with who they are and the communities they're in.
Right, and this is largely a problem only in the Messianic community.
Right.
Because, for instance, if a U.S. president goes to the Western Wall, they'll put a kippah on his head. They're not
and we're
saying...
confusing about it, too, because it's a problem only within Messianic Judaism, except when Messianic Judaism forces it. So, like, you go to Messiah Conference. I mean, and I don't mean this to come across as harsh towards anything in particular, but you go to Messiah Conference, and on a regular basis, they'll have guest pastors come in to speak at the conference, and then when they're done, some of the leadership of the MJ will walk up with a tallit and a kippah, and like it's like a gift of honor for them, and they're trying to recognize them. They'll wrap a tallit around them and put a kippah on them. But then at the same time, on the other side, they'll go, but this is Jewish stuff, and Gentiles shouldn't be. It's absurd how we, like, when it's convenient to us, we're okay with it, and it's not appropriation.
Because the pastor, odds are, and there's no shade on the pastors or guest speakers that they do this with. Odds are they're going back to whatever denomination that they're in. They're not people who are committed to and living in and amongst the Messianic Jewish community. They're not people who are walking hand in hand with, other than supportive on the fringes and, giving them money and of time and of resources, but they're not the people who are showing up faithfully.
Mm-hmm. Right. That pastor that got that tallit and kippah is probably not going to be wearing it on next Sunday at their congregation.
Right.
Or might. And then follow it by,
you can buy one of these,
wrapping a Torah scroll around somebody and coronating them king,
or you,
which was a thing a few years ago that happened. Man. It was not at Messiah Conference, by the way. Let me go back and say that,
and not among
Messianic Judaism. So here's the thing, I'll dive into this at this point because I think it's important for us to understand. Like, one, we have to give honor where honor was due, right? And the reality is that my dad's generation and those before him are pioneers of the modern Messianic Jewish movement.
Right.
And they very literally poured blood, sweat, and tears to get the movement to where it is. And so they had to wrestle, and very literally were wrestling that identity crisis where they were, Jewish one day, told they weren't Jewish the next, and then suddenly Jewish again, but still not Jewish enough or believing enough, Christian enough, and whatever. So there's very literally that identity crisis. So there's this constant battle of trying to prove to the Jewish world they're really Jewish, or to the Christian world they're really believers, or whatever. And I get it, and I understand it. And so I definitely give honor where honor's due, because to have to fight that battle on a daily basis is a lot, right? And to constantly run around with it. But on the other hand, I think it's important that we recognize that I think one of the key signs of the success of what the pioneers have done is that particular identity crisis has generally not been inherited. And so, like, my generation of Messianic rabbis, especially within the IMCS and those some of those within the UMJC, my generation of Messianic rabbis have very much not inherited that identity crisis. I grew up, even before my dad, and on the show we've talked about this some before, even before my dad kind of came to terms with the fact that he was a Jewish believer and kind of started walking that lifestyle, when I was a kid and we were still in a church, which, like, we started with Messianic Judaism when I was in like second or third grade, something like that. So, we're not talking a very long period of time in my childhood. But when I was a kid in church, I had arguments with people on a regular basis of how I was Jewish and a believer at the same time. And my dad didn't even admit he was Jewish. So, like, Messianic Judaism is innate in my identity. It's at the crux of who I am, and it's a part of my DNA. But at the same time, with that, I don't feel a need to prove anything to anybody. So I am perfectly comfortable being a Messianic Jew whether the Jewish world likes that I am or not, or whether the Christian world likes that I am or not. And it doesn't faze me in the least when I come across the negative comments or the scrutiny or what have you. And I believe that that's a significant part of what the pioneers paved a way for, but haven't really been able to recognize is there. And that's, I think, a big part of why congregations like ours, like yours, like Restoration in Seattle, like Adat HaTikva in Chicago, like Baruch Hashem in Phoenix, and Baruch Hashem in Dallas and San Antonio, and a number of other congregations around the U.S. in particular, have been able to be successful while fully including non-Jewish people, not only in membership in their congregation and lifestyle and practice of the Jewish life cycle within the Messianic Jewish congregation, but also in leadership roles in the congregations, because I don't feel a need to prove anything to anybody. Either you like me or you don't, but that's not my problem. Right. I'm here to put the best I can forward of the image of Yeshua. Whether anybody else is on board with that or not, it's not my problem. And I'm not trying to dance around anything. I'm not trying to tap dance around anything. I'm not trying to walk on eggshells. I'm not trying to if you've listened to this show long enough, you've realized that I have zero problems. And if you're not sure whose voice this is, I'm going to make it clear so nobody else gets blamed for it. I am Rabbi David. I have zero issues with saying exactly what I think, whether others like it or not. And so a big part of that, though, is because I didn't inherit that identity crisis.
Right.
I give honor to those that have had to walk with that and fight with that, because I can only imagine. I witnessed the turmoil firsthand because it was my dad, but I didn't carry that. I never had to walk in that. And I think that's helped at least our congregation in dramatic ways.
Yeah, I think that to a great extent, and you mentioned this or started to mention in this direction, but a lot of the people my age or older that are leaders within the movement fought these great battles that needed to be fought.
Right.
Unfortunately, for some, they didn't realize the battle was won. And so we're still fighting the battle, even though the battle's been won. In other words, I have great relationships with Jewish not yet believers in Yeshua that are very close relationships with them, because I'm not fighting the battle to be recognized as Jewish. That's not my goal. Isn't to be recognized as Jewish. I am Jewish. I don't need to prove it in any way. And so it's kind of like, the people that are still alive that fought in World War II. There are those that still hate the people that they fought against in World War II, even though that battle, those victories, those wars ended generation ago.
Right.
And so there are some within the Messianic movement that are still fighting battles that have been won a generation ago. And so and what happens is that takes the emphasis away from fighting the battles that we're supposed to be fighting now. We're always supposed to be fighting battles. We're going to continue to be in a war as long as we're in this world, a spiritual war. But if we're still fighting an enemy that's no longer there, we're not spending the time actually fighting the battles that we are in right now.
Right.
And so that's why I'm so adamant about taking away that fear identity, the battle of I have to prove that I'm Jewish, or I have to prove that I'm a believer, or I have to prove that you can be a believer and be Jewish and not be a Christian, or I have to, all of those things are should be set aside, because there are very few believers that haven't heard of Messianic Judaism now. There are some. They may not know where we are, but they've heard about us.
Right.
Paul Wilbur, Lamb, those groups that pioneered Messianic music, Promise Keepers made Road to Jerusalem and impacted through that. There's the MJAA and its impact globally. And there's the Union and its impact globally. There's Chosen People's Ministry, Jews for Jesus. These groups are known. So we're not fighting to exist anymore.
Right.
Now our battle now is to unify the kingdom and restore what initially was, in my opinion. And we can't do that if we're still fighting to identify as who we are, as Jew or Gentile, or building walls of division that God's broken down. That we really have to stop that and put that war aside. That war's been won. We have the victory. It should change.
I think part of that change is recognizing, obviously that there needs to be a change, but also recognizing that you need the right leaders for that change. When you go to plan a war, you don't go next door to the barracks filled with lieutenants to plan a war. You go to the office building filled with generals, and people who are, and again, that doesn't mean old. That doesn't mean the old. It doesn't always have to be the older people.
It doesn't exclude the older people.
It doesn't exclude the older people. It means you find the people who are trained who have the chest candy, who have the ribbons and the badges and all the colors and fancy things that say, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm talking about. I've done it. I can do it. Put me in a place where I can lead this thing to the next phase or next step.
Right.
You can't. Maybe I'll get in trouble for saying this. I don't know.
Go for it. Let's have the fun. Take it from me. I got plenty of experience.
I know. If you have people whose experience caps out at captain, at sort of a mid-level range, which is a good range to be at. That's a good place to be. You didn't get there easily, and you didn't. You had a fair share of battles to get there.
You still catch some of the mess that rolls downhill, but you don't catch all of it.
Exactly. But if you continue to only allow captains to lead, you will never get to the place where you really are supposed to be. That's why, that's one reason why, and we have talked about this previously, although briefly. I thought it was funny that one year at one of the conferences they actually used one of the little mantras that exists for the officer corps in both the Army and the Air Force, which is mission first, people always. The thing is, if you actually are mission first oriented, you have to actually acknowledge what is best for that. And one of the ways that is best is not retaining leadership in the same places and the same people all the time. Mm-hmm. It was one of the reasons why the Army every 3 years, every 4 years, you rotate command. You have change of command. You have change of command ceremonies where this captain has been here for a long time. This general has been in this place for a long time, leading this particular thing for a long time. And again, 3 years is a long time, and then that 3-4 years. All right, let's rotate. And you bring in a new guy, someone who's got experience, but someone who's also new, someone who has fresh ideas, someone who has a different way of doing things, a different routine. Sometimes ways that are uncomfortable because it means changing something, it means changing the way you look at something. But often those are the things that win battles. Those are the things that win wars, and that's like, you don't have to be a PhD level military historian to know that. I mean, you just have to read a book about, people like Eisenhower or Patton, They were very different from their predecessors in how they waged war. They also had a very new war to wage, a war that involved, a very automated war, war that involved lots of mechanics, lots of maintenance. And we're kind of in that in the Messianic movement. We are in a different fight now than the fight that a lot of the pioneers were in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Like, kind of from the 90s on, Messianic Judaism is, especially with the prevalence and the speed of the internet and YouTube, we have a whole new war to fight. We have a lot of maintenance to do. We have a lot of quick moving pieces and information, and we need to bring people into leadership positions who understand that, who are trained into working in those positions.
Since you're bringing up leadership positions, and we talked about this briefly before we started recording this episode, you and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, which you brought in, and I actually think it'd be fitting to roll it in at this point, since we've kind of broached this on because identity crisis is a big part of this particular issue,
right?
But on the titles that we allow people to be ordained within the Messianic movement, for both major Messianic organizations, only those that are Jewish are allowed, by the organization's definition of being Jewish, are allowed to carry the title, to be ordained with the title rabbi,
right.
And then you can get Messianic teacher, Messianic congregational leader, Messianic pastor, or something along those lines. And between the IMCS and the UMJC, those terminologies may vary some, but generally speaking, they will not allow you to be ordained as a Messianic rabbi unless you're actually Jewish.
Right.
And a part of that is because of the identity. Well, we don't want anybody to confuse somebody with the title rabbi if they're not actually Jewish, and the title rabbi has an immediate connotation that you're Jewish and what have you. And then the other part of it is the other side of the identity crisis discussion, which is a fear, somewhat rational perhaps and somewhat irrational perhaps, that if we allow too many Gentiles in the movement, that it will no longer be a Jewish movement, which I disagree with. I know, Rabbi Eric, you were wanting to pop in with something.
Yeah, I wanted to say that this goes back to that change that I'm talking about in the generations, because previous to where we are now, there was almost a need to say, we're Jewish and only Jewish people can be rabbis, because we were trying to get other people to accept our identification as Messianic Jews. Now we've crossed a place to where we've established that there is something called Messianic Judaism, and what that is a blend of Jewish and non-Jewish people worshiping in a Judaic fashion, a biblical Judaism that includes both Jews and non-Jews. Now that we've identified that, we've self-identified and expanded that identification out, at this point, we should be able to then identify for ourselves what our leaders are going to be called. In other words, we shouldn't have to, at this point, worry what the church is saying about what we call our leaders, or Judaism outside of Messianic Judaism, because we've already established our identification. The other thing that I wanted to say, and this is kind of in this but out of this, and it goes with what Rabbi Jonathan was saying just a minute ago, talking military terms. In Pensacola, we have the Naval Air Station.
Right.
In the Naval Air Station, the training facilities we have, they change every couple of years from a Marine commander to a Navy commander. So that the flights, they change. One time there's a Marine officer that's in charge. One time there's a Navy officer that's in charge.
And those are very different cultures.
And they're very different cultures, very different ranks. Navy ranks are different than Marine ranks. All the things are different. But it doesn't matter if it's a Marine or it's a Navy officer. The position they hold is called the same regardless of which organization they're from. And the reason I bring that back is this is not just a Jew-Gentile thing, but we need to get to the point where if somebody is in a recognized Messianic organization, whether it's the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, the International Messianic Jewish Alliance, or any of the other organizations, if they're part of our movement, if they're recognized as that they're not teaching heresy, they're teaching biblical, the concepts, they're in agreement with the statement of faith, that it shouldn't matter if a union rabbi takes in place in a IMCS congregation, they should be accepted. And doesn't mean accepted in the organization, because a colonel in the Marines isn't accepted as a Navy officer. He doesn't become a Navy officer, but he does hold the position in that position. And we should stop in this self-identification and this battle for identity. We should understand that there are multiple groups that are all working in the same direction. They're all part of the U.S. military, so to speak. And we should not be fighting against those that are fighting on our team just because they're in the Navy versus the Marines or the Air Force or the Army. And we have to get to that point where our identity is strong enough in our Messianic Judaism that we welcome the involvement of the other parts of Messianic Judaism to achieve our goal. Because if we don't do that, we're going to constantly be fighting old battles.
Can I ask in this analogy?
I'm scared.
Where does
now.
the Space Force fit in?
That would be the millennials.
Where does Space Force fit in? I don't know.
Is that Gen Z? Is that the next one? I don't know how this goes, but it's just important that we understand that we've already established our identity as Messianic Judaism. We're not some esoteric, far out thing that nobody's aware of.
Right.
We've already self-identified. We've already established that, and we need to stop doing things that allow other people to put our identity to us instead of establishing it ourselves.
We keep dancing around the mulberry bush,
right? And so that's why at our congregation we call Rabbi Jonathan, even though he's not Jewish by genetics or birth or genealogy, any of those things. But nobody in our congregation is confused by that because the position of rabbi holds a definition.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you'll notice, like, if you go to conferences, like, I've only, out of all the leaders that show up, almost all their name tags say rabbi.
Yeah.
So-and-so. And I know there are lots of them who are not Jewish.
That's the thing that makes me laugh, is that on their certificate it says one thing, but on your name badge at the conference it'll say something else.
Right.
Like, if we're willing to put it on the name badge, why are we not willing to just put it on the certificate? Like, it's absurd. And even at that, though, and this is what really was the crux of the conversation that you and I were having, Jonathan, is that one of the suggestions Jonathan made is, in the same sense that rabbi has a distinct connotation, right? There's an assumption that goes with it, which is kind of the reason why the organizations are hesitant at giving the title as ordination to Gentiles.
There's some luggage that comes with it.
Yeah. At the same time, that's true with pastor. Right. The IMCS at least will ordain people as a Messianic pastor, but then we're fighting to prove we're not a church while we're installing pastors over our congregations. Like, it doesn't make sense. Now, I understand why most Messianic leaders in Israel use the term pastor there. Like, there's an entirely different scenario there.
Different battle.
It's an entirely different cultural context there. I get that. But here, like, why are we... And so one of the suggestions... Now, I'm a proponent of do the work, earn the title, give everybody the ordained title of rabbi. Right. That's fine with me. Do the work. You put in the time, you do the work. If everybody's on equal playing field, let's do it right? Now, Jonathan did pose an idea to me of how to kind of dance around that to some degree, and still have rabbi as an ordained title reserved for Jewish people, if that's what you want to do, but not force pastor or congregational leader as something, just a generic term on Gentile leaders, but instead to use a term that is actually historically used within Judaism. And I'll let you kind of throw that out there. But.
Yeah, well, we had, I've been researching a lot this summer, learning just about, the history of Judaism within the Southeast, and not even Messianic Judaism, like just straight, Orthodox and Reform Judaism. And Reform Judaism historically is something else, not what you normally see today. Historically, Reform Judaism is
more like conservative Judaism that we know today.
It's Orthodox Judaism, but we want our liturgy in English.
Yeah. And what Reform Judaism was intended to be is not what it is now.
Right. So, and I had visited I forget the name. Let me look it up. But anyway, we were in Charleston this summer, and one of the synagogues there in Charleston, South Carolina, it's the fifth oldest synagogue in the U.S., and it's the oldest still running synagogue in the U.S. Today. So it still holds services. There's an active board, an active rabbi. Sorry, I want to find the name of this just so I can
feel better.
Yeah, I want to give it. Okay, yeah. So it's Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, and so it's been there, since the actual building that's there today has been there. It's pre-Civil War, for those American history buffs. The first building was built between the early 1800 and 1830 something. before it burned down, and then they, of course, rebuilt it. But I make that point to, it's old. It's been there a long time. The congregation was actually there long before that as an Orthodox, a Sephardic Orthodox community. And on their plaque there of the synagogue, they don't have their first leader who led that synagogue once they became a chartered by the city of Charleston as a religious center, as a synagogue. Their first leader did not hold the term rabbi, because there was no smicha available, no Orthodox smicha available in the United States. In other words, there were, the idea of smicha, the laying out of hands, is it's the Moses to Joshua, to the elders, to their disciples, their disciples, their disciples. It's what discipleship is. You raise up someone, you lay on of hands, you pray and ask God that part of your spiritual authority would be conveyed to this person, and they carry that on, and they carry on your teaching and your tradition, etc. So there were no Orthodox rabbis to give this to the leadership of this community. So this, Jewish man went to seminary, Christian seminary in the United States. And at that point, we had things like Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and received, the education there, and they called him, and even on his plaque in the synagogue, it's not Rabbi so-and-so, it's Reverend so-and-so. And this was, and I was reading about that this happened for several, quote-unquote, rabbis, Jewish leaders of congregations, that for several decades, they had a lot of guys by the title of Reverend, because that's what they could be. They didn't have, they acknowledged they didn't have the proper channels to have actual Jewish laying on of hands, the smicha from a proper ordained Jewish authority, so they just embraced the title Reverend. So my suggestion to David was, if we want to have this distinction, that's like, we just have to have it, why don't we use something that actually has some bearing in American Jewish history? And Reverend is one of those titles that actually has some bearing in American Jewish, especially Southern American Jewish history.
And because Rabbi Jonathan is a history buff, that makes perfect sense to him.
Right.
But I will tell you that to me that would just add one more layer of swirl to the discussion. No, and I understand the reasoning, and I understand all that. But
and my thing is like, well, if we want to have, because we already have swirl.
Right.
We already have, we have 4 different titles in the IMCS. So if we already have 3 other layers of swirl, why don't we just reduce it to 1 layer of swirl and cut out the middleman and just, embrace something that actually, again, has some...
And my answer is that I think we should just call everybody rabbi.
I would, yes.
And by doing so, stop worrying about what other people think about what we're doing, and letting them force us to identify. If we're going to say that we're Messianic Judaism and our authority as an organization, as a movement, comes from our leadership, then only our leadership should have the ability to tell us what we're going to call ourselves.
Right.
And we should not worry about the Christians saying, well, you're really just a pastor pretending to be, or the Jewish people saying, well, you're really just a pastor saying, and we just say, I don't care what you say, this is who we are, this is how there are enough of us now that we've established we exist. Let's self-identify. Let's stop feeding the fear and ceding authority in our lives to people that aren't in authority.
Right. No, I know, and I agree with that. I'm just feeding answers to people who refuse to hear answers.
Right. And you're absolutely valid in saying that there were Jewish leaders in early America that called themselves Reverend.
Right.
And that wasn't an aberration or something shameful or something other. It's just a reality. But again, this goes down, and this goes back to the original of this podcast. I think it's time that we need to stop fighting a war that's already been won, and start walking in the victory of our establishment as a real, living, breathing movement.
Right.
The reality is Messianic Judaism, as we know it today, is about congregational movement. We'll go that route. Congregational movement, as of today, is about 40 some odd years old, give or take. Now you have Messianic Jewish congregations that were established before that, but as a organizational movement, about 40 years old. It was the early 80s when the organizations were planted, and then Messianic Judaism itself, both as Hebrew Christianity, but also as an intentional Jewish movement separate from Christianity. I don't mean separate in the sense of like keeping them at arm's reach, but not in churches, but in the Jewish community, has really been around since the mid 1700s to early 1800s. So it's not a young, I mean it is, but it's not a young thing. And the reality is it's a revival of what occurred in the first and second century. There's never been a point in history where there wasn't since the first century, where there wasn't a Jewish presence of Jewish believers living among the Jewish people, living Jewish lives, preaching Messiah. Since the first century, there's never been a period in time where that didn't exist. It wasn't as loud and vocal as it is today. Right. Wasn't as well known, but there's never been a period of time where it didn't exist. And just looking at the congregational movement, the rabbinic movement of the past 40 some odd years, we are at a point now where what made sense and worked 30, 40 years ago as a fledgling movement, as a fledgling group of organizations, as a fledgling kind of flock of congregations scattered around trying to make a place for themselves, a sector for themselves. What made sense 30, 40 years ago isn't necessarily making sense so much now. Right. You know, and we need to be able to willing to have the necessary conversations without all of the extra stuff, just legitimate conversations that lead to legitimate evolution of what we're doing. And that's an important factor, because if we think back to just the last 100 some odd years of the Messianic movement, originally it was Hebrew Christianity that met on Sundays, wanted nothing to do with Jewish tradition and practice, just recognizing that we are Jews that believe in Jesus, to becoming Messianic Judaism, where we started to sort of implement some Jewish practice and tradition in, or at least started meeting on Saturdays instead of Sundays, to now full-on congregations where we use liturgy on a regular basis. We have High Holy Day services. We have rabbis and so on.
Bar and bat mitzvah.
Yep, where we fully implement a Jewish life cycle into our congregational existence. And we still have some of the same fights going on, some of the same problems going on. Like, we're clearly willing to evolve as time goes on and recognize, and even at that, you have two different sides of the movement, where you've got some that still kind of have the Hebrew Christian mentality of we want very minimal Jewish practice and tradition included in what we're doing, and then the other side of it that we want everything to be very specifically Jewish practice and tradition, and you've got a wide fan from something that looks like a charismatic church with a little bit of Jewish flair that meets on Saturdays to Orthodox synagogues that you might hear something about Yeshua every once in a while in, and that's the spectrum of the pendulum that we swing in. But the reality is that there's a middle ground that is probably 80+% of the Messianic Jewish movement that is normative in total perspective, but is normative and should be the driving factor for the evolution of the movement, of where we're going. And so I'm watching as in, for instance, the MJIMCS, which like at conferences, and I'll just talk about conferences. At conferences, there's every year less and less Jewish tradition and practice used in the conference events and services, while the younger participants in these conferences are yearning for more and more of the traditional practice. Right. And in the UMJC, there's more and more of traditional Jewish practice and such in conferences and such, while the younger generation are yearning for more of the Spirit leading, not a rejection of or a dilution of the practice, but the inclusion of more worship, intentional Spirit-led worship and such. And so it's clear we can look at the younger aspects, the 20-somethings and such of both organizations, of both sides of the movement, congregationally speaking, and see that they are their own middle ground, right? They are the answer to each's own desire. And I don't know, maybe, and I'm going to throw this out there, maybe working together a little more than working apart from each other could help with this a lot. I don't know.
We need to change our mindset from either or to and also.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not either this or that, but it's and this and also that. And not just in practice, but also in the Jew-Gentile and also in the organizational aspects of it. So we're so glad that you guys tuned in to listen. We hope you'll share this with other people. If you have comments or thoughts you want to share with us, please contact us through any of the mediums that are available to reach us through our social media or through the different apps that our podcast is on. And we're so glad you're listening to us. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.